And so what Brentro and Broken Leg and other people have done who are involved with this Circle of Courage is built whole programs around this. I've seen schools that have this Indian symbol up as you walk into the school. And in one school I went into, they had Post-its that they put up during the year so that when a child showed a sense of mastery or independence or generosity or whatever, or helped other kids to feel a sense of belonging, they got to put a finger-painted handprint up on either a set of windows or a wall, and then a little Post-it that was underneath it that said, on this date, Billy showed generosity. This was the kind of the spiritual foundation for the science that they were trying to implement to educate kids. Wonderful idea. Here's another practical thing from the Far West Labs in the United States. They did some research on what schools have to do to be successful with at-risk kids, including those with disabilities. And notice what they're suggesting, making those kids a priority in the school. I have threatened my wife, who is very tolerant of all this traveling that I'm doing usually, that when I'm through doing all this traveling, I want to become a local superintendent as my last full-time job. And if I could do that, it would be so fun to do that, because I would write a letter to the school board and say, here's the only reason to hire me. I want you to understand something. The number one priority in the school district, if you hire me, are the at-risk kids. Not one of the priorities, the number one priority. And then they're going to say, well, what about the gifted kids? And I'd say, they're at risk. They're as much at risk as the kids who are retarded. I mean, come on. Schools don't flex well. That's the dilemma that we face. If we built our programs around the needs of at-risk kids, that is the RTI revolution. We'd have more success with all kids, I would contend. This is the most important issue right here on this page that the Far West Labs found. The subgroup of the subgroups that has been hurt the most by No Child Left Behind, that federal law in the U.S., is which subgroup of the subgroups? You have any idea? It's African American young men. And the reason that's true in the United States is because of the low expectations that educators in the United States have in too many places for African American young men. And kids achieve right to our expectations. Oh, these kids aren't going to be able to learn because, the dad's not even there. He doesn't even know who his dad is. He's in a single mom family, and she's had several boyfriends, and they're very poor, and they always are getting evicted. And, just very typical. How can we be expected to be able to be successful with that kid? The way you see the world determines what you do. That determines what you get. So that point is very, very well taken, I think. So that makes some sense, I think, in terms of context, to take a comprehensive approach. Here's another way of looking at it. This slide is cleverly designed so that you can't see it on your computer screen. You can't see it more than 5 rows back in this room where we're in. And it's difficult to see even on a piece of paper. So do you like it? It's just perfect for a keynoter, yeah. But the reason I decided to put it on here anyway is that it reflects, actually from a book written in the UK, what the effective schools literature is trying to tell us in the 40 years of data collection that's been going on with the effective schools literature. This is what schools look like that are successful. This is what classrooms look like that are successful. If your focus is student achievement, this is what you have to do. And what I like is that on the emphasis on learning part of this pie chart is one little piece of pie called focus on effective instruction. In other words, what schools do that are really successful is they don't allow teachers to teach any way they want to. What they say to teachers is, you know what? We know how to teach kids. We have a teacher evaluation system that's based not on a bias, but based on 40 years of research about how to educate kids. You're expected to teach consistent with that 40 years of research. Now, that violates this notion when I get my credential, my job is to go in my classroom, close my door, and if I academically abuse kids, at least I won't bother anybody else because the door's closed. No, that's not the idea. The idea is to be held accountable to what we're doing. We're professionals. Acting like professionals would be a good idea, I think. This one piece of pie differentiates teachers most of all in my observation of well over 1,000 teachers. I would tell you that when you walk in a classroom and you see frequent monitoring of student learning progress for instructional decision making, when you see that in the classroom, you know that the teacher's doing it well. You know what I'm talking about. The master teacher who, when you walk in, you can see that master teacher looking around the room constantly, checking to see in an informal way, am I getting across what I'm trying to get across? Asking the appropriate question at the right moment to see whether or not kids are mastering what the comments are that the teacher is making. Doing more formal progress monitoring with 1-minute timings every so often with kids to make sure that you understand what's happening. Taking a look at screening devices like Dibbles every so often to see whether or not this teaching is getting through to these kids. I went to one school district in Ohio in the United States that's really in trouble, and they had invested, somebody made a lot of money on this, they had invested in these data walls, and they're really cool because they look like they're just little things, but when you look behind them, they're about this thick, and as you spring them open, they turn into this big wall. And the teacher said, "Is this the coolest thing?" Notice we have red Post-its and green Post-its and yellow Post-its, and we can put the kids where they need to be in terms of the proficiency levels. I said, "That's good. Why is there dust on the Post-its?" "Well, what do you mean?" "Well, I understand that you kind of place the kids at the beginning of the year as kids in the red group who really are in trouble, and kids in the yellow group who are sort of in trouble, and kids in the green group who are sort of like doing okay. But I noticed that the Post-its haven't moved, and I'm here in the second semester. Are we supposed to move them? I thought we were just supposed to put that on the wall." So, the purpose of data collection for progress monitoring is not to collect the data. The purpose of data collection is to use the data. That's part of the RTI revolution. Now, at the essence of it, Schmoker wrote in a book that's called Results Now that he wrote in 2006, the real essence of all this is instruction, as I've been talking to you. That's the focus. That doesn't cost more money, by the way. It takes commitment to what works, but it doesn't cost more money. John Goodlad is one of the real giants in American education. Some of you might have read some of Goodlad's work. When I was a student at UCLA, I didn't realize how lucky I was that I was there during the time that John Wooden was the basketball coach and UCLA was winning national championships, and that was kind of cool. But in graduate school, he was the dean, and he's really a wonderful man. And what he says is, this idea that I'm talking to you about instruction is just not a pedagogical imperative, it is a moral imperative, he said, that we educate kids this way. So here's the latest on this from Marzano, and you can get a copy of this electronically and on the wiki and take a look at this. But as I mentioned to the group yesterday, I can't think of a better 10 questions for a rubric for coaching teachers than what Marzano has given to us in this book called The Art and Science of Teaching. Just scan through the list if you would, if your bifocals are good enough, or if you can read this. And notice that these 10 questions deal with two things. One is the structure of the lesson, and the other is relationships with students. There's been this big debate about what's more important, relationship with students or structure of lesson. Guess what the answer is? And, another and. To be a great teacher, you've got to have great structure and have great relationships with all of your students. And that's what Marzano has uncovered by looking at the research, 40 years of research called the Effective Schools Literature. This is really fine stuff. Take a look at that book if you can get a hold of it. The Art and Science of Teaching. Larry Tian, who's one of the heroes in the RTI revolution, he's the head of curriculum for Lee County schools in Florida. And they've shown some of the best results of any district in the country related to RTI. If you're interested in taking a look at the best RTI manual that I've found anywhere, go to, in the Google search bar, Lee County Schools, Florida, RTI, and you'll find a PDF of the best manual you can possibly imagine, including decision rules of how you move kids from Tier 1 to Tier 2 to Tier 3 service. Beautifully prepared. Now, these people back in 1987 said that teaching had 6 to 10 times as much impact on achievement as all of the socioeconomic factors that Larry was talking about combined. We can overcome whatever kids bring to us if we choose to do it effectively. Dufour, the father of this concept called professional learning community, how many of you would say you work in a PLC? A few of you are raising your hands. Now, when I say it again, I want you all to raise your hands because it's very cool to say that you work in a PLC. How many of you work in a PLC? Oh, yeah, so cool. Okay, well, that's what we do. We have a tendency to say we do, but do we really? What Dufour uncovered is that if you don't have a stretch culture, you really aren't a PLC. And the stretch culture is we're going to do whatever it takes in order for kids to learn. That's another context that makes some sense. Now, I created these questions, and it's helped a few school systems to be able to get into this RTI thing. And just look at the first two questions, if you would, and it creates a good discussion. Well, how would outcomes in practice be affected if we made educational decisions based on student outcome data versus tradition? The second question is, well, what would happen if we focused our school reform efforts on the needs of students at risk rather than on the needs of kids who don't need effective instruction to learn proficiently? We were blessed with 3 kids who could have learned if there was a cardboard cutout of a teacher in front of the room. Because they were students, and by the way, the pressure was on them from home. And by the way, the support was there at home. And by the way, there were chores at home. And by the way, get your homework done before you turn on the computer. Or things that we always did. When that kind of support is there, then it doesn't make too much difference what you do. There are lots of school districts in the United States that are suffering from a malady that's an interesting one. It's called their reputation. Because 20 and 10 and 5 years ago, they were all having great success with all of their kids. Then the demographics changed. And some kids who are these aren't our kids. Well, they suddenly are our kids because they're living like in the community. Are there. And suddenly the procedures that we use, the practice that we use, is now not working with those kids. Remember that point about the way you see the world determines what you do and that determines what you get? Is it the kid's fault or is it our fault that the kids aren't learning? Okay, enough on that, I think. This is a piece that was done in 2003 by an organization that is really an organization of organizations in the United States called the Learning First Alliance. It is the best piece of work I know on what school divisions need to do if they're going to have success with all kids. And what they did is look at school divisions that relatively have more success with all of their kids than less success. And here's what they found school divisions have to do. This has created a lot of good discussion in terms of building context. And notice right here that it says, number 4, districts made decisions based on data, not instinct. And notice on number 7, it says districts committed to sustained reform over the long haul, rather than allowing the next superintendent to change everything when there's a new superintendent in town. As I said to the one board member who graced us yesterday, that your responsibility as a representative of the owners of the school system is to take hold of that long-term vision, and to have that long-term vision clearly in mind when you hire a new superintendent, so that you're hiring a superintendent to implement the long-term vision, not hiring a superintendent to change everything. Does that make sense? That makes sense from this research that was done by this great group. So, this is another way of looking at context, and we talked about this yesterday. I won't get into this in detail, but Covey talks about these 4 roles of leadership and how you have to merge these 4 roles. The one thing I didn't mention yesterday that I wanted to mention today is this. One of the roles is called empowering. And this was an example of something that Stephen Covey gave me in terms of insight that I want to give you. My wife and I both have supervised a lot of people in our careers, and we've had this interesting argument. The argument is, can you empower another person? How many of you would say you can empower another person? Raise your hands. How many of you would say, no, you can't? You can't empower another person. Raise your hands if you believe that. So I believed that you can empower another person. Jan believed that you cannot empower another person. So I went to Stephen when I first met him, and I said, Stephen, please answer this question correctly, because I've never won any argument with my wife. I want to win this one. Tell me you can empower another person. You know what he said? You can't. He said leadership is being a gardener, not a mechanic. Even when you do all that you think you should with your tomato plants, you don't always get world-class tomatoes. And with human beings, they always have a choice about whether they'll follow you. So a part of this whole RTI revolution is to really think about leadership in a way that it reflects what that concept is. Create what you think is the best empowering environment, and then use the data. Are people actually following through? If they're not, then change the environment, is the point that Stephen would make. So Donalyn Anton, who recently retired from the Los Angeles Unified School District, said it this way. She said, you know what, Steve, context is everything. So let's get into the context that comes from RTI then. The third constant in life is called choice. Yogi Berra, who just had his 85th birthday, some of you might know that name. He was a catcher and a left fielder for the New York Yankees, who really sucked. The Boston Red Sox are much better, but that's another story. But Yogi said, it's not over till it's over. And he also said one time, no one goes to that restaurant anymore, it's too crowded.